My twin brother visited me at the veterans psychiatric facility with a fractured cheekbone and trembling hands. When I discovered his abuser was his own son-in-law, a man systematically stealing his life savings while his daughter watched, I knew exactly what to do. We traded clothes in the visitor bathroom. Henry stayed in the quiet safety of my room under my name. I walked out the front gates wearing his favorite cardigan, stepping directly into his personal hell. Bradley Mitchell thought he was bringing home a broken old man to sign away a deed. He brought home a retired military investigator with absolutely nothing to lose. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe bullies always eventually mess with the wrong person. The autumn wind cut through the courtyard of the Oak Creek Veterans Retreat. I sat on a wooden bench, watching the dead leaves scatter across the concrete pathways. I had checked myself into this facility 2 months ago. The silence was supposed to help me process the sudden passing of my wife. Instead, the quiet only sharpened my mind. I spent my days analyzing the orderlies, predicting the medication schedules, and keeping my investigative instincts active. I survived 30 years in military intelligence. You never truly turn that part of your brain off. I saw Henry walking up the main path before the receptionist even buzzed him through the secondary gates. We share the exact same face, the same height, and the same 71 years of age. But Henry always carried himself differently. He was an accountant, a man who built a quiet, comfortable life reading spreadsheets and avoiding confrontation. Today, his posture was entirely wrong. He was hunched over, his shoulders pulled inward as if anticipating a physical blow. He wore thick, dark sunglasses, despite the heavy overcast sky. He clutched his hands together, his knuckles white against the gray fabric of his favorite wool cardigan. He sat down heavily on the bench beside me. He tried to force a smile, but the movement was stiff and unnatural. He told me he was just passing through the area and wanted to check on my grief counseling. I did not respond to his pleasantries. I stared directly at the dark lenses hiding his eyes. I reached out quickly, my hand darting forward before he could react, and pulled the sunglasses off his face. He flinched violently, raising his arms in a defensive posture. The entire left side of his face was a swollen canvas of purple and yellow. A deep laceration cut across his cheekbone, held together by cheap butterfly bandages. The swelling forced his left eye half shut. Henry immediately started talking fast, his voice shaking. He told me he fell down the wooden stairs leading to his basement. He claimed he tripped over a loose rug and hit the banister. It was a pathetic lie. I spent 3 decades interrogating captured insurgents and hostile combatants. I know what an accidental injury looks like, and I know the undeniable signature of a closed fist. I leaned forward, invading his personal space, forcing him to look at me. I told him the angle of the bruising was entirely inconsistent with a downward fall. I pointed out the defensive bruising on his forearms, the faint fingerprints darkening his wrists. I told him he was lying to the only person on earth who could read him perfectly. I demanded a name. Henry began to weep. It was not the quiet crying of a sad man. It was the heavy, suffocating sobbing of a completely broken human being. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving with every breath. I did not pat his back. I did not offer hollow words of comfort. I simply waited for the emotional dam to break. When he finally caught his breath, the horrifying truth spilled out into the cold air. His son-in-law, Bradley Mitchell, was destroying him. Bradley operated a mid-sized logistics firm that was currently drowning in undisclosed debt. To save his failing company, Bradley demanded Henry sign over his entire retirement portfolio, a sum totaling nearly $2 million. When Henry refused, citing his need for medical care and living expenses, the verbal abuse escalated into physical violence. 3 nights ago, Bradley cornered Henry at the top of the basement stairs. He demanded the signature again. When Henry said no, Bradley shoved him backward. Henry tumbled down 12 wooden steps, striking the concrete floor at the bottom. The impact fractured his cheekbone and cracked 2 ribs. I felt a cold, familiar rage settling deep in my chest. I asked Henry where his daughter was when this happened. I asked him what Allison did while her husband threw her father down a flight of stairs. Henry looked at the ground. He whispered that Allison was standing in the kitchen. She saw the entire thing. She did not call an ambulance. She did not yell at Bradley. She simply turned around and walked upstairs, leaving her father bleeding on the cold basement floor. Later that night, Bradley stood over Henry's bed. He delivered an absolute ultimatum. Henry would sign the asset transfer documents by the end of the week. If he refused, Bradley would have him legally declared mentally incompetent and permanently committed to a state-run psychiatric ward. Allison had already agreed to sign the medical affidavits, claiming Henry was suffering from violent dementia. My twin brother was entirely trapped. His own flesh and blood had weaponized his age and vulnerability against him. He came to my facility to say goodbye, fully believing his life was over. I stood up from the wooden bench. I did not feel grief anymore. I felt absolute crystalline clarity. I looked at Henry and told him to stand up. I grabbed his arm and marched him directly into the visitor center, bypassing the orderly station, and pushed him into the main restroom. I locked the heavy door behind us. Henry looked at me, confused and terrified. I unbuttoned my jacket and threw it onto the sink counter. I ordered him to take off his clothes. I told him he was not going back to that house. I told him he was staying here, in my room, under my name, where the facility security would keep him entirely safe from Bradley and Allison. He stammered, arguing that Bradley would simply send the police to find him. I looked him dead in the eye and told him Bradley was not going to look for him. Bradley was going to find me. We traded everything. I put on his gray wool cardigan, his tailored slacks, and his comfortable walking shoes. He put on my military surplus jacket and heavy boots. I took his wallet, his car keys, and the house keys. We matched physically in every detail, right down to the receding hairline. With the addition of the cheap pair of reading glasses from his pocket, I was his perfect mirror image. I gave Henry strict instructions. I told him to go to my room and lock the door. I told him Dr. Vance, the chief resident and my former military colleague, would be checking on him shortly. I had already sent Vance a text message requesting a 2-week medical isolation period for severe grief management. No visitors would be allowed. No phone calls would be connected. Henry would be a ghost, completely protected by medical privacy laws. I walked out of the bathroom, leaving my terrified brother behind. I walked past the reception desk, out the front gates, and found Henry's sedan in the parking lot. I adjusted the mirrors, started the engine, and drove toward the wealthy suburbs. I was no longer a grieving widower. I was a precision instrument of retaliation. The drive took exactly 45 minutes. I pulled into the sweeping circular driveway of Henry's sprawling brick estate. It was a beautiful home, paid for entirely by Henry's decades of hard work. Now, it was infested with parasites. Before I even put the car in park, the heavy mahogany front door flew open. Bradley Mitchell stormed out. He was a large man, artificially bulked up from expensive gym memberships, wearing a tight designer polo shirt. His face was red with fury. He marched down the front steps, grabbed the handle of the driver's side door, and yanked it open before I could turn off the ignition. He reached inside, grabbed a fistful of my wool cardigan, and violently hauled me out of the driver's seat. He slammed my back against the side of the car. He screamed directly into my face, his breath smelling of stale coffee and aggressive entitlement. He demanded to know where I had been. He demanded the signed portfolio transfer documents immediately. I did not resist. I forced my shoulders to slump. I let my head drop forward, avoiding eye contact. I commanded my hands to shake, mimicking the terror Henry felt every single day. I stammered, my voice weak and raspy. I told him I went to the bank to get the paperwork, but there was a complication. Bradley tightened his grip on my collar, lifting me slightly off the ground. He asked what kind of complication. I kept my voice small and pathetic. I explained that because the portfolio exceeded $1 million, the bank manager refused to release the funds based on a simple signature. They required me to appear in person tomorrow morning with a certified notary to legally finalize the transfer. It was a calculated lie, designed to buy me exactly 24 hours of unrestricted access to the inside of the house. Bradley cursed loudly, spitting on my cheek. He shoved me hard in the chest. I let my legs buckle, falling backward against the car door, playing the role of the frail old man perfectly. He pointed a thick finger at my face and told me that if the money was not in his corporate account by noon tomorrow, he would throw me down the basement stairs again. And this time, he would make sure I did not wake up. He turned around and marched back into the house, leaving the front door wide open. I slowly pushed myself off the car. I brushed the dirt off my borrowed trousers. I walked through the front door, quietly shutting it behind me. I descended the wooden stairs into the dark, damp basement guest room they had forced Henry to live in. I sat on the small, uncomfortable cot. The trap was officially set, and the prey was completely oblivious to the danger he was currently locked inside with. The basement air was thick with dampness and the faint, bitter smell of mildew. The small, rusted cot groaned in protest under my weight every time I shifted my position. Henry had lived in this miserable concrete box for 6 agonizing months. I lay perfectly still in the dark, staring upward at the exposed copper pipes running across the ceiling. I did not close my eyes. Sleep is a luxury you discard when you are operating deep inside hostile territory. I waited patiently for the heavy, oppressive silence of the house to settle. I listened intently to the floorboards above me, tracking the movements of the enemy. I followed the heavy, careless footsteps of Bradley Mitchell as he paced the living room, drank heavily from a glass, and finally retreated up the main staircase to the master bedroom. I gave him exactly 2 hours to fall into a deep alcohol-induced slumber. When the digital clock on the dusty nightstand flashed 2 in the morning, I threw off the thin, scratchy blanket. I moved with the silent, deliberate precision I had perfected during night raids in classified combat zones. I crept up the wooden basement stairs, placing my weight perfectly on the outer edges of the steps to prevent the wood from creaking and betraying my position. I slipped through the massive kitchen, carefully avoiding the moonlight spilling through the large bay windows, and navigated the long hallway toward Bradley's private home office. The office door was locked with a basic brass deadbolt. It was an insulting, pathetic obstacle. I pulled a small tension wrench and a rake pick from the inner lining of my borrowed wool cardigan. I had confiscated these exact tools from a hostile operative 2 decades ago, and I never left home without them. The cheap residential lock yielded to my hands in under 4 seconds. I pushed the heavy oak door open just enough to slide my body through, closing it silently behind me. The office was a monument to unearned arrogance and fragile masculinity. Even in the dim ambient light filtering through the closed blinds, I could clearly see the excessive mahogany desk, the imported leather chairs, and the framed photographs of Bradley aggressively shaking hands with local politicians. It was the perfectly curated space of a weak man desperate to project a power he did not actually possess. I stepped behind the massive desk and woke the sleek, expensive desktop computer. A password prompt illuminated the dark room, casting a harsh blue glow across my face. Bradley struck me as a man who confused physical aggression with actual intelligence. Men like him never understood genuine security. In my 30 years running counterintelligence operations and profiling high-value targets, I learned that a password is rarely a random string of secure characters. It is almost always a direct reflection of their deepest, most unchecked ego. I did not need advanced decryption software to bypass this machine. I only needed to understand the pathetic nature of the man who shoved my brother down a flight of stairs. I typed the name of his logistics firm followed by the year he founded it, and an exclamation point. The system immediately rejected it. I paused, adjusting my assessment. I typed his own name, Bradley, followed by the word boss and the number 1. The screen instantly flashed green, and the desktop materialized. It was almost too easy. It proved exactly how careless and overconfident he was. He felt so utterly untouchable inside his own home that he left the keys to his entire criminal kingdom resting beneath a digital lock a child could guess. I opened his primary financial document folders. I expected to find the desperate, disorganized ledgers of a failing business owner. I expected to see red ink, overdue notices, and final warnings from angry creditors. What I found was infinitely worse and far more calculated. Bradley was not just a terrible businessman struggling to stay afloat. He was an active, methodical, and highly organized criminal. I navigated through a complex labyrinth of hidden spreadsheets, my eyes quickly processing endless columns of manipulated numbers. I had audited supply chain logistics during overseas military deployments, tracking millions of dollars in black budget spending. I recognized the fraudulent pattern immediately. Bradley was running 2 separate sets of books. The official ledger showed his logistics company hemorrhaging money, reporting massive operational losses to the federal government to completely dodge corporate taxes. The secondary hidden ledger painted the true terrifying picture. He was systematically draining his own company, shifting massive operational revenue into offshore untraceable shell accounts, using phantom shipments and fake vendor invoices. He was stealing directly from the government, starving his own business, and using my brother retirement fund as a temporary band-aid to cover the visible operational costs and keep the auditors away. It was textbook massive corporate tax fraud. The exact kind of federal crime that carried severe mandatory prison sentences without the possibility of parole. But the financial web grew significantly darker as I dug deeper into the hard drive. I opened a subfolder buried deep within the network drive, cryptically labeled with his wife's initials. I clicked on a series of encrypted PDF documents. They were property deeds, luxury vehicle registrations, and high-yield private investment portfolios. Every single one of them was legally registered exclusively under Allison's name. Bradley was funneling the stolen, untaxed corporate money directly into his wife's personal assets. He was building a massive financial fortress for himself, while hiding like a coward behind her clean legal identity. A cold, absolute realization washed over me. Allison was not merely a passive, terrified woman trapped in an abusive marriage. She was the primary beneficiary of her husband's criminal enterprise. When she stood in the kitchen and watched her father bleed on the concrete basement floor, she was not paralyzed by fear. She was actively protecting her illicit wealth. She knew exactly where the money was coming from, and she was entirely willing to sacrifice Henry. Life savings, his safety, and his sanity to maintain her luxury lifestyle without drawing the attention of federal tax auditors. Her betrayal was complete, absolute, and utterly sickening. I pulled a small, high-capacity encrypted flash drive from my pocket. I plugged it directly into the computer tower and began a mass data transfer. The progress bar crawled slowly across the screen, illuminating my face in the dark room. I copied the dual ledgers, the offshore account routing numbers, the fake invoices, and every single legal document bearing Allison's signature. I was no longer just protecting Henry Retirement Fund. I was assembling the exact legal guillotine that would sever Bradley and Allison from civil society permanently. The data transfer hit 99%. Suddenly, the wooden floorboards in the hallway directly outside the office creaked under a heavy weight. Someone was awake. I watched the progress bar inch toward completion as the heavy, shuffling footsteps grew louder, moving deliberately toward the closed office door. I did not panic. I calmly hovered my finger over the eject button, my muscles coiling tight, preparing for the inevitable violent confrontation. The screen finally flashed a small notification indicating the transfer was completely successful. I pulled the drive, slipped it into my pocket, and powered the monitor down into total darkness, just as the brass doorknob began to turn. Morning arrived with the harsh mechanical humming of the central heating unit vibrating through the basement ceiling. I sat up on the rusty cot, feeling the deep ache in my lower back. The physical toll of sleeping on a thin mattress over concrete was significant, but it was nothing compared to the agony my brother had endured down here for half a year. I carefully stood up and stretched my legs, forcing my joints to loosen. I walked over to the small, cracked mirror hanging above the utility sink. I studied my reflection in the harsh fluorescent light. I adjusted the cheap reading glasses on my nose and practiced the defeated slump of Henry posture. I traced the edge of the butterfly bandages on my cheek. The bruising had deepened overnight, turning a dark, ugly shade of violet. It was a glaring billboard of domestic violence. I took a slow, deep breath, locking the retired military investigator away behind the frightened eyes of a broken accountant. It was time to face my niece. It was time to find out exactly how much of her soul she had sold to Bradley Mitchell and whether she was worth saving from the impending fire. I climbed the wooden stairs with agonizing slowness, letting my footsteps drag heavily against the wood. I pushed open the door to the main house and stepped into the sprawling designer kitchen. The room was flooded with bright morning sunlight, reflecting off the pristine white marble countertops and the stainless steel appliances. It was a room built for a culinary magazine, paid for entirely by fraud and extortion. Allison was standing near the expensive espresso machine. She wore a luxurious silk robe, holding a steaming ceramic mug with both hands. She did not look up when I entered. She did not ask how I slept. She did not ask if I needed ice for my face. She did not ask if I needed pain medication for my cracked ribs. She did not show a single ounce of human decency. She simply reached over to a silver toaster and dropped 2 slices of cheap plain bread onto a small ceramic plate. She slid the plate across the cold marble island toward the edge where I stood. The toast was unbuttered and completely cold. It was a profound, insulting gesture designed to remind me of my absolute lack of value in this house. I pulled a heavy wooden stool back and sat down, keeping my eyes lowered. I stared at the dry toast. I needed to know the exact depth of her complicity. The financial documents I stole last night proved she was legally benefiting from her husband's crimes, but I needed to look into her eyes to see if any shred of daughterly love remained. I needed to know if she was a hostage to Bradley violence or a willing participant in this nightmare. I slowly raised my hand and touched the swollen purple flesh around my eye, pressing just hard enough to make myself flinch. I let out a soft, pathetic wince, ensuring the sound carried across the quiet kitchen over the humming of the refrigerator. I looked up at her. I called her name using the soft, trembling voice Henry always used when he was afraid. She finally turned her head and looked at me. Her expression was completely blank. There was no pity. There was no shame. There was only a thin veil of extreme annoyance. I asked her directly about the stairs. I kept my voice weak and fragile. I asked her why she walked away when Bradley pushed me. I asked her why she turned her back when I hit the ground. I asked her how she could sleep comfortably in her massive bed while her own father lay broken in a damp basement just a few feet below her. I laid the trap perfectly. I gave her the ultimate opportunity to break down, to apologize, to tell me she was terrified of her husband and desperately needed help to escape him. If she had shed a single genuine tear, if she had offered one word of real remorse, I might have spared her from the absolute destruction I was preparing to unleash. I waited for her humanity to surface. Allison took a slow, deliberate sip of her expensive espresso. She set the ceramic mug down on the marble counter with a sharp click. She crossed her arms over her silk robe and looked down at me with absolute contempt. She told me I was overreacting. She told me I was always too sensitive and that I needed to stop playing the victim. Her voice was flat and perfectly steady. She said Bradley was under a tremendous amount of corporate stress and that I was intentionally provoking him by being stubborn about the retirement portfolio. She actually blamed the victim for bleeding on her floor. She leaned forward, resting her hands on the cold marble, and delivered the final fatal blow to her own future. She told me to stop being so utterly dramatic. She said the money was just sitting in a retirement account, doing absolutely nothing, while they were desperately trying to maintain their social standing and keep their business afloat. She commanded me to go to the bank this morning without any more complaints, sign the legal transfer documents, and hand the entire portfolio over to Bradley. She said it was the only way to keep the peace in her house. She told me if I just did what I was told, nobody would have to get hurt anymore. The silence that followed her words was deafening. I looked at the daughter my brother had raised. I looked at the woman he had sacrificed his entire adult life to provide for. She was completely hollow. She did not view him as a father. She viewed him as a stubborn obstacle standing between her and her unearned luxury. She knew exactly what Bradley was doing, and she fully endorsed the violence because it served her financial interests. The last lingering shred of familial hesitation inside my chest evaporated into nothing. The cold military pragmatism took absolute control. I realized in that exact moment that Allison was not collateral damage. She was the primary target. I slowly lowered my head back down, staring at the plate of cold toast. I let a fake tear roll down my uninjured cheek, playing the role of the defeated father to absolute perfection. I nodded slowly, whispering that I understood and that I would go to the bank. Allison let out a heavy sigh of relief, turning her back to me to pour another cup of coffee. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully bullied a broken old man into total submission. She had no idea that she had just signed her own financial and social death warrant by choosing a shiny espresso machine and a silk robe over her father life. I picked up the dry piece of bread and took a slow, deliberate bite, chewing the tasteless food with cold, mechanical precision. The interrogation was officially over. The verdict was completely guilty. I would burn her perfect world to the ground right alongside his. I swallowed the last piece of dry toast and carefully washed the ceramic plate in the stainless steel sink. The cold water rushed over my hands, grounding my thoughts and preparing my mind for the next phase of the operation. I dried my hands on a pristine white linen towel and slowly shuffled out of the kitchen. I kept my shoulders hunched and my gaze fixed firmly on the floorboards, perfectly maintaining the physical profile of a defeated old man. I navigated the wide corridor leading toward the front foyer, where Henry kept his heavy winter coat and sensible walking shoes. The hallway was a narrow gallery of unearned wealth. Expensive abstract paintings hung on the walls, illuminated by perfectly angled recessed lighting. A massive crystal chandelier hovered near the front entrance, casting fragmented rainbows across the imported Brazilian hardwood floor. Every single luxury item in this house was a physical manifestation of Bradley greed and Allison's silent complicity. I reached the small mahogany bench near the front door and sat down heavily, pretending to struggle with the simple act of tying my shoelaces. I was not actually struggling. I was intentionally delaying my departure, listening to the heavy thudding footsteps echoing from the second-floor staircase. Bradley was finally awake. He descended the stairs with the clumsy, aggressive energy of a man nursing a severe hangover and a guilty conscience. He wore expensive athletic clothing that failed to conceal the soft, bloated physique of someone who drank too much expensive scotch and spent too much time sitting behind a stolen desk. He spotted me sitting by the door, and his face immediately darkened into a familiar mask of rage. He marched across the foyer, closing the distance between us with intimidating speed. He planted himself directly in front of me, intentionally blocking the natural light spilling through the front windows. He leaned down, his massive frame casting a dark, oppressive shadow over my seated body. He demanded to know why I was still inside the house. His voice was loud and grating, vibrating with a violent impatience that told me he was desperate to secure the stolen retirement funds before his corporate facade completely collapsed. I kept my head down, staring at the toes of my shoes. I answered him in a thin, trembling whisper, explaining that my joints were stiff and I needed a moment to catch my breath before walking to the bus stop. I told him the bank was only a few miles away, and I would be there before the manager returned from his morning coffee break. My intentional display of weakness did not pacify him. It only infuriated him further. Predators like Bradley despise weakness because they secretly fear it in themselves. He reached down and grabbed the collar of my borrowed wool cardigan, hauling me violently to my feet. My back slammed against the heavy wooden front door, rattling the brass hinges. He pressed his forearm against my collarbone, pinning me in place. He screamed that he did not care about my stiff joints or my breathing. He told me I was entirely useless and that I existed only to serve his financial needs. He raised his right hand, pulling it back into a tight, heavy fist. I saw the exact moment the decision formed in his dull eyes. He was going to punch me directly in the face, just like he had done to my brother. He wanted to break my spirit completely before sending me to the bank to ensure I would not dare ask the teller for help. He committed all his weight to the strike, swinging his fist in a wide, sloppy arc aimed squarely at my jaw. He made a fatal miscalculation. He believed he was attacking a terrified accountant. He did not realize he was launching an assault on a man who had spent 3 decades training in advanced close-quarters combat and surviving hostile interrogations. I did not need to think. My body reacted entirely on pure, ingrained instinct. In the fraction of a second, before his fist could connect, I shifted my weight, dropping my center of gravity and stepping slightly to the outside of his striking path. His massive fist sailed harmlessly past my ear, violently punching the empty air. Before he could recover his balance or comprehend his miss, my left hand snapped upward like a coiled spring. I caught his extended wrist with absolute mechanical precision. I did not grab his arm to hold him back. I seized the specific cluster of delicate bones and sensitive nerve endings resting just below his hand. I twisted his wrist outward at a severe, unnatural angle, while simultaneously applying intense downward pressure with my thumb directly into the radial nerve. The effect was instantaneous and entirely devastating. The human body cannot simply ignore that level of concentrated structural agony. Bradley let out a sudden, high-pitched gasp as the pain shot up his arm and directly into his central nervous system. His knees immediately buckled under him. All the aggressive power completely vanished from his massive frame as he collapsed downward, crashing heavily onto the imported hardwood floor. He landed squarely on his knees, crying out in shock. I maintained the joint lock for exactly 3 seconds, keeping him entirely paralyzed at my feet. I stared down at him, watching the sheer terror bloom in his wide, bloodshot eyes. He was completely helpless, trapped by a grip he could neither break nor understand. I let him feel the absolute reality of his own physical vulnerability. I let him realize that his size and his anger meant absolutely nothing in the face of genuine lethal capability. Then, just as quickly as I had engaged, I completely released my grip. The violent military operator instantly vanished, retreating back into the shadows of my mind. I took 2 rapid steps backward deliberately, stumbling against the mahogany bench. I let my shoulders collapse inward. I raised my trembling hands to my mouth, opening my eyes wide in a perfect pantomime of elderly panic. I let out a loud, wavering gasp and asked him if he was all right. I quickly apologized in a high, reedy voice, suggesting that he must have slipped on the polished floorboards while trying to reach for the door handle. I asked if he needed me to call Allison for help. Bradley remained kneeling on the floor, clutching his rapidly swelling wrist against his chest. He was panting heavily, his face entirely pale and slick with cold sweat. He stared up at me with a mixture of profound confusion and deep primal fear. His brain simply could not reconcile what had just happened. He remembered the excruciating pain and the impossible speed of the counterattack, but his eyes only saw a frail, hunched old man trembling in a wool sweater. He slowly pulled himself up, using the wall for support, never taking his eyes off me. He did not say another word. He simply backed away down the hallway, cradling his arm entirely stripped of his false dominance, leaving the path to the front door wide open. I turned the brass knob and stepped out into the crisp morning air. the first physical victory officially secured. I walked to the end of the sweeping circular driveway, leaving the heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the brick estate behind me. I pulled my brother's smartphone from my pocket and ordered a rideshare vehicle. The black sedan arrived within 10 minutes. I climbed into the back seat, giving the driver a polite nod, but offering no conversation. I watched the manicured lawns and wealthy suburban homes blur past the tinted window. This neighborhood was a monument to carefully constructed lies. Bradley and Allison lived in a fragile bubble financed entirely by my brother's lifelong discipline. That bubble was about to burst permanently. The ride to the downtown financial district gave me ample time to review the tactical parameters of my next move. I was not just protecting Henry's money today. I was actively weaponizing it. Financial starvation is the most effective method for dismantling a parasite. Without the constant flow of stolen capital, Bradley's logistics company would collapse under the weight sheet of the federal tax audits I was preparing to unleash. Without her luxury credit cards, Allison would be forced to face the harsh reality of the man she had married. I stepped out of the vehicle in front of the massive glass and steel facade of the First National Heritage Bank. The building was imposing, designed to project stability and absolute security. Today, it would become my personal fortress. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors and stepped into the expansive marble lobby. The air was cool and smelled faintly of expensive cologne and polished stone. I immediately slumped my shoulders forward, re-engaging the physical persona of the terrified accountant. I approached the main reception desk with a slow, hesitant shuffle. The young woman behind the counter wore a crisp blue suit and a practiced corporate smile. I handed her Henry's platinum account card and his state-issued driver's license. My hands trembled slightly as I passed the plastic over the cold marble counter. I asked to speak with the senior branch manager regarding a massive asset transfer. She scanned the card, and her eyes widened slightly as the system displayed the staggering balance of the retirement portfolio. Her corporate smile instantly transformed into an expression full of deep professional deference. She picked up her telephone and whispered a few words into the receiver. Within 60 seconds, a tall man in a tailored gray suit emerged from a set of frosted glass doors. He introduced himself as Mr. Sterling, the executive branch director. He offered a firm handshake and gently guided me toward his private corner office. He offered me a cup of premium coffee and asked how he could assist with the portfolio transfer I had called about yesterday. He fully expected me to sign the wealth over to Bradley Mitchell. I sat down in the plush leather chair across from his massive mahogany desk. I took a slow, steadying breath, letting the frightened old man persona completely dissolve. I straightened my spine, pressing my shoulders firmly against the leather. I looked Mr. Sterling directly in the eyes. My voice was no longer a trembling whisper. It was cold, authoritative, and absolute. I told him there would be no transfer to Bradley Mitchell today or ever. I informed him that I suspected my son-in-law of engaging in severe corporate financial fraud and attempting a hostile extortion of my assets. Mr. Sterling dropped his expensive silver pen on the desk, the color rapidly draining from his face. Banks despise the mere mention of federal fraud. They despise legal liability even more. I did not give him time to panic or offer hollow corporate apologies. I took total command of the room. I handed him a prepared list of absolute directives. First, I ordered an immediate total freeze on all secondary access to my accounts. Every joint credit line, every debit card, and every authorized user linked to the portfolio was to be terminated instantly. Bradley and Allison would discover their plastic was entirely useless the next time they tried to buy a cup of coffee. Second, I demanded the immediate liquidation of the primary retirement portfolio. The entire $2 million balance was to be converted into a secure wire transfer. Mr. Sterling stared at me in stunned silence, his fingers hovering over his computer keyboard. He stammered, asking where I intended to send such a massive sum of liquid capital. I pulled a thick, sealed envelope from the inner pocket of my wool cardigan and slid it across the desk. It contained the legally binding establishment documents for an irrevocable blind trust. I had authorized my personal lawyer, Carter Reed, to draft the paperwork late last night using a secure encrypted connection. Carter was a ruthless corporate litigator and a former military subordinate who owed me his life. He built legal fortresses that no civil attorney could ever breach. The trust was specifically designed to be entirely impenetrable. As the primary beneficiary, Henry would receive a comfortable monthly stipend for the rest of his life, ensuring his medical care and housing were permanently secured. However, he legally surrendered all direct control over the principal balance. This meant that even if Bradley held a gun to my brother's head, Henry literally could not authorize a transfer. The money was gone, completely shielded behind walls of aggressive corporate law. Mr. Sterling verified the routing numbers and executed the transfer with nervous efficiency. I watched the computer monitor as the massive account balance dropped to zero. The trap was locked. The bait was removed. I stood up, buttoned my cardigan, and walked out of the bank. Bradley was currently sitting in his stolen house, eagerly waiting for a financial rescue that was never going to arrive. I returned to the cold dampness of the basement guest room and sat on the edge of the rusty cot. The digital clock on the dusty nightstand read 1:15 in the afternoon. I calculated the timeline with absolute military precision. Bradley Mitchell was a creature of pathetic habit. His logistics company always settled their primary vendor accounts on Thursday afternoons before the banks closed for the weekend wire transfers. He relied entirely on my brother retirement platinum credit line to float his failing business operations. A logistics firm burns through massive amounts of daily capital to cover diesel fuel costs, driver salaries, and warehouse leasing fees. Without a constant flow of stolen money, his entire fleet of delivery trucks would literally grind to a halt within 24 hours. Today, that artificial lifeline was completely severed. I leaned back against the cold concrete wall and closed my eyes. I did not sleep. I simply listened. I waited for the inevitable explosion. Financial starvation works exactly like physical starvation. The panic sets in slowly at first, and then it completely consumes the target, driving them to absolute desperation. At exactly 2:45, the heavy wooden floorboards above my head groaned under a sudden violent impact. The front door of the estate had not just been opened, it had been kicked violently against the wall. I heard the unmistakable sound of shattered glass as something heavy was thrown across the foyer. Bradley was home. His heavy footsteps thundered across the imported Brazilian hardwood floor. He was not walking. He was stomping with the frantic, uncontrolled energy of a cornered animal. I heard his muffled voice echoing through the ventilation ducts. He was screaming at Allison. He was shouting about a humiliating public encounter. He had attempted to pay for a massive corporate luncheon with his most important shipping clients using the joint platinum card. The waiter had returned to the table and loudly informed him that the card was permanently declined. His perfect corporate facade had just violently crashed into a brick wall of insufficient funds. Allison tried to calm him down, her voice shrill and panicked, but he silenced her with a loud, aggressive roar. I remained perfectly still on the cot, regulating my breathing. I let my shoulders slump forward and commanded my hands to adopt the familiar, terrified tremor. The wooden door at the top of the basement stairs was suddenly ripped open, hitting the drywall with a loud crack. Bradley descended the wooden steps with terrifying speed. He did not bother turning on the overhead light. He brought the darkness with him. He reached the concrete floor and marched directly toward my small cot. His face was entirely flushed, a dangerous shade of crimson. His expensive silk tie was yanked completely loose, hanging unevenly around his thick neck. He was sweating profusely, his chest heaving with exertion and pure, unadulterated panic. He held my brother platinum credit card pinched tightly between his thick fingers. He thrust the piece of plastic directly into my face, stopping mere inches from my nose. He demanded to know what I had done at the bank. His voice was no longer the arrogant boom of a wealthy executive. It was the desperate, ragged shriek of a man watching his entire life disintegrate in real time. He screamed that the card was violently declined in front of his investors. He screamed that his corporate accounts were frozen and his vendors were threatening to seize his delivery trucks by tomorrow morning. He grabbed the collar of my wool cardigan, preparing to haul me to my feet and resume his physical abuse. I looked up at him through the cheap reading glasses. I made sure my eyes were wide and swimming with manufactured terror. I raised my trembling hands in a defensive posture, shrinking back against the cold concrete wool. I let my voice crack, perfectly mimicking the frail pitch of a frightened elder. I told him I did not understand what he was talking about. I told him I went to the bank exactly as he had commanded me to do. I explained that I sat down with Mr. Sterling, the branch manager, to sign the asset transfer documents, but the system suddenly locked us out. Bradley tightened his grip on my sweater, his knuckles turning white. He demanded to know why the manager stopped the transfer. I delivered the fatal blow with absolute precision, keeping my voice small and pathetic. I whispered that the bank automated security algorithms had flagged the entire portfolio for massive fraudulent activity. I told him the federal banking system detected severe financial irregularities, connecting his corporate tax identification number directly to my personal retirement accounts. I explained that the bank noticed highly suspicious secondary transfers routing my pension money into offshore shell accounts registered under Allison's name. The color drained entirely from Bradley's face, leaving him a sickening shade of pale gray. His jaw went completely slack. He slowly released my sweater, his thick fingers trembling. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He knew exactly what fraudulent activity meant. He knew about the dual ledgers, the stolen employee pensions, and the hidden corporate assets I had discovered on his computer the night before. He assumed his careless financial crimes had finally triggered a catastrophic internal bank audit. He did not suspect for a single second that the frail old man sitting on the cot had orchestrated the entire blockade. He stared at the piece of plastic in his hand, as if it had suddenly turned into a venomous snake. He took a slow, stumbling step backward, away from the cot. He asked me in a hollow, breathless whisper what the bank manager did next. I nodded slowly, wiping a fake tear from my cheek. I told him Mr. Sterling said it was mandatory bank procedure to completely freeze all secondary access to protect the primary account holder. I told him the bank legally seized the entire $2 million balance and transferred it into an inaccessible federal holding trust, pending a full criminal investigation. I looked up at him and delivered the final, devastating sentence. I told him the bank manager said he was legally obligated to notify the Federal Financial Crimes Division and the Internal Revenue Service whenever corporate tax fraud was suspected on a senior citizen account. Bradley dropped the credit card onto the cold concrete floor. The plastic made a sharp, pathetic clicking sound. He could not breathe. He reached up and grabbed his chest, his eyes darting frantically around the dark basement. His arrogant empire of stolen wealth had just evaporated, leaving him entirely exposed to federal prison. He turned around and walked slowly up the wooden stairs, completely paralyzed by the impending destruction of his freedom and his future. The trap had slammed completely shut. The heavy wooden stairs groaned as Bradley stormed back up to the main floor. The front door slammed so hard, the foundation of the house seemed to vibrate. A few seconds later, the aggressive roar of his luxury sports car engine ignited in the driveway. The tires screeched against the asphalt as he sped off toward the financial district. He was rushing to the bank to scream at tellers who had absolutely no power to help him. He was chasing a ghost while the real threat remained firmly planted inside his home. I waited in the basement for another 10 minutes. I listened to the ambient sounds of the house. The television in the living room was turned off. The water in the kitchen sink stopped running. I heard the faint clicking of Allison high heels crossing the hardwood floor, followed by the closing of the garage door and the hum of her own expensive vehicle pulling away. She was likely heading to a high-end boutique or a day spa completely oblivious to the financial apocalypse that had just descended upon her marriage. The house was entirely empty. The battlefield was completely mine. I walked up the stairs, leaving the frail accountant persona behind in the darkness. My posture straightened and my senses heightened. I bypassed the home office I had infiltrated last night. I already possessed the digital evidence of his tax evasion and his offshore accounts. But men like Bradley always keep a physical backup of their most damning secrets. They do not trust the cloud, and they do not trust digital encryption. They trust heavy steel and hidden compartments. I moved directly to the second floor and pushed open the double doors leading into the master bedroom suite. The room was disgustingly opulent. It was a massive space decorated in aggressive shades of silver and dark velvet. A massive chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling, and the king-sized bed was covered in imported silk sheets. It was a monument to unearned privilege built entirely on the broken back of my brother. I did not waste time looking through the obvious places. I did not check the bedside tables or the large walk-in closets. I approached the room like a hostile forward operating base. I scanned the architectural lines of the floor and the walls looking for discrepancies in the measurements. I walked slowly across the thick, plush carpet, feeling the distribution of weight beneath my boots. True secrets are never kept at eye level. They are buried. I moved toward the heavy custom-built mahogany dresser anchored against the far wall. It was an imposing piece of furniture covered in expensive cologne bottles and designer watches. I knelt down on the carpet and pressed my cheek against the floor, looking at the small gap between the bottom of the dresser and the floorboards. The carpet fibers underneath the center of the dresser were slightly flattened, indicating that a heavy object had been dragged back and forth across that specific spot multiple times. I gripped the lower edge of the solid mahogany frame. I braced my legs and pulled with a sudden concentrated burst of strength. The massive dresser slid forward across the carpet, groaning under its own weight. Directly beneath where the dresser had been sitting, a section of the hardwood floor looked slightly different. The grain of the wood was perfectly matched, but the small seams between the planks were entirely free of dust. I pulled a thin pocket knife from my trousers and wedged the blade into the microscopic gap. I applied upward pressure, and a perfectly square 2-foot section of the floorboards popped loose. I lifted the wooden panel away, revealing the dark gray steel of a heavy-duty mechanical floor safe sunk directly into the concrete foundation. It was a high-end model featuring a solid titanium dial and a hardened steel casing. Bradley clearly believed this vault was impenetrable, but he was relying on commercial security to protect him from a military intelligence operator. I knelt beside the open floor cavity and brushed my fingertips lightly against the cold metal of the combination dial. I did not have a stethoscope, but I did not need one. Mechanical safes like this one rely on a series of internal brass wheels aligning perfectly to release the locking bar. They give off microscopic physical vibrations when the wheels click into the correct position. It requires absolute silence and extreme tactile sensitivity. I closed my eyes, shutting out the visual distractions of the luxurious bedroom. I placed my right ear just inches from the steel surface and gripped the dial with my thumb and index finger. I began to spin the wheel slowly to the right, clearing the internal mechanism. The cold metal turned smoothly under my touch. I reversed the direction, applying a slight upward tension on the dial to force the internal locking bar against the wheel gates. I turned the wheel micromillimeter by micromillimeter, feeling for the faint vibration of metal dragging against metal. The house was dead silent. I could hear my own heartbeat thumping steadily in my chest. After 4 long minutes of absolute concentration, my fingertips registered a tiny, distinct click. The first wheel had dropped into place. The number was 34. I held the tension and reversed direction again, sweeping past the first number and feeling for the second gate. It took another 3 minutes of painstaking microscopic adjustments before the second click vibrated through the steel. The number was 12. I reversed the dial one final time, turning it slowly to the left, until the final gate caught the locking bar with a heavy, satisfying clunk. The number was 88. I pulled the heavy steel handle upward. The airtight seal hissed as the thick vault door swung open on its hidden hinges. The inside of the safe was entirely empty except for 3 thick, leather-bound ledger books and a single manila envelope. I pulled the heavy books out and placed them on the plush carpet. I opened the first ledger. The pages were filled with Bradley cramped, aggressive handwriting. These were not the digital spreadsheets I had copied from his computer last night. These were the raw physical records of his most egregious crimes. I scanned the columns of names, dates, and dollar amounts. My blood ran completely cold as the horrifying reality of the numbers became clear. Bradley was not just stealing from the federal government, and he was not just extorting his father-in-law. He was systematically draining the pension funds of his own employees. He was taking the hard-earned retirement money from the truck drivers, the warehouse workers, and the logistics coordinators who kept his failing business running. He was quietly siphoning thousands of dollars every week from working-class families, shifting their future security into his own pockets to pay for his luxury cars and his wife's designer clothing. It was an act of pure, absolute economic violence. He was destroying the lives of dozens of innocent people to maintain his pathetic illusion of wealth. I opened the manila envelope. It contained the original signed documents for Henry retirement portfolio transfer, perfectly forged and notarized by a corrupt legal contact. Bradley had kept the forged documents ready, intending to force Henry to authorize them retroactively to cover his massive illegal tracks. He was going to use my brother's legitimate savings to fill the massive gaping hole he had torn into his employees' pension funds right before the federal auditors arrived. It was a perfectly evil, self-sustaining cycle of theft. I pulled out my encrypted flash drive and a small digital camera from my pocket. I spent the next 20 minutes photographing every single page of the 3 physical ledgers, capturing the undeniable proof of his systemic embezzlement. I photographed the forged documents and the specific bank routing numbers he was using to hide the stolen pension money. The digital evidence I gathered last night would send him to federal prison for tax evasion. But this physical evidence would destroy him entirely. When the Labor Board and the federal pension investigators saw these ledgers, Bradley would face decades behind bars. His reputation would be completely obliterated. His own employees would rightfully demand his head. I carefully placed the ledgers and the envelope back into the dark cavity of the floor safe. I closed the heavy steel door, spinning the dial rapidly to lock the mechanism. I replaced the square wooden floorboard, making sure the seams were perfectly aligned. I pushed the massive mahogany dresser back into its original position, covering the hidden vault completely. I stood up and brushed the lint from the knees of my borrowed wool cardigan. The operation had escalated far beyond a simple domestic dispute. This was no longer just about protecting my twin brother. It was about dismantling a predator who was feeding on the innocent. I walked out of the master bedroom, pulling the door firmly shut behind me. I descended the stairs and returned to the damp basement, sitting back down on the uncomfortable cot. I placed the reading glasses back on my nose and let my shoulders slump forward, waiting patiently for the furious, defeated monster to return from the bank. I sat on the edge of the rusty cot in the dim basement light, pulling the small digital camera from my pocket. My mind was still processing the sheer scale of the corporate embezzlement I had just uncovered in the master bedroom safe. But Bradley was not the only parasite feeding on my brother. Before I had closed the heavy steel floor vault upstairs, I had noticed a slim leather portfolio tucked underneath the corporate ledgers. It was embossed with Allison initials in elegant rose gold lettering. I had quickly photographed its entire contents before securing the safe, not having the time to analyze the numbers while standing deep inside enemy territory. Now, in the quiet dampness of my temporary concrete cell, I scrolled through the high-resolution images on the tiny glowing screen. I needed to understand the exact financial architecture of my niece. I needed to know exactly why she was willing to stand by and watch her father be physically destroyed. The answer was laid out across dozens of glossy credit card statements from exclusive banks that catered only to the ultra-wealthy. I zoomed in on the first page of the most recent billing cycle. The outstanding balance printed at the top of the statement was absolutely staggering. Allison had accumulated exactly $82,000 in high-interest unsecured luxury debt. I read through the itemized list of transactions, feeling a deep, sickening disgust building in my chest. This was not debt accrued from medical emergencies or failing business investments or simple household necessities. This was pure, unadulterated vanity. There were massive charges for $10,000 designer handbags imported from Paris. There were receipts for weekend wellness retreats at exclusive mountain spas costing $5,000 a night. I saw endless transactions at luxury shoe boutiques, high-end cosmetic surgeons, and private dermatology clinics. She was living the lifestyle of a millionaire heiress entirely on borrowed money. She was swiping platinum credit cards with absolute reckless abandon, building a mountain of compounded interest that she had absolutely no independent means to repay. Her husband's logistics company was bankrupt, and his secondary income was entirely stolen from his own hardworking employees. Allison had no trust fund of her own, and she had not worked a single day since she graduated from college. She existed inside a fragile bubble of manufactured wealth, entirely dependent on the illusion of Bradley corporate success. But the dates on the credit card statements painted a very clear and desperate picture. Her spending had accelerated wildly over the past 6 months, exactly when Bradley business began to fail. Instead of cutting back on her extravagant lifestyle to support her husband, she had doubled down using retail therapy to ignore the impending financial collapse of her marriage. She was buying imported silk robes and diamond tennis bracelets, while the men who drove her husband delivery trucks were having their pension funds secretly drained. It was a level of profound selfishness that I found deeply difficult to comprehend. The horrifying truth of her silent complicity finally clicked into perfect focus. I stared at the digital image of a final notice warning from a premium credit card company. They were threatening immediate legal action and asset seizure. When Henry was shoved down the wooden stairs 3 nights ago, Allison did not walk away because she was paralyzed by fear or intimidated by Bradley's violent temper. She walked away because she needed her father to sign over his retirement portfolio just as desperately as her husband did. She was entirely trapped in a financial prison of her own making. The creditors were undoubtedly beginning to circle, demanding minimum monthly payments that she could no longer afford to make. If Bradley's corporate facade completely collapsed, her secret mountain of luxury debt would be exposed to the public, and her carefully curated social standing would be instantly obliterated. She viewed Henry's $2 million pension as a massive, unavoidable personal bailout. She was fully expecting her father's estate to wipe her financial slate completely clean. She had calculated the value of his life savings against the cost of her designer wardrobe, and she had decided that her shoes and her handbags were significantly more valuable than his physical safety. It was a level of cold, calculated sociopathy that rivaled the absolute worst criminals I had ever investigated during my military career. She was not a victim of circumstance trapped in a toxic household. She was a willing, active predator who used silence and apathy as her primary weapons. She had watched her father bleed on the concrete floor, and her only thought was how his submission would pay for her next vacation. The betrayal was so deep and so absolute that it completely severed any lingering biological loyalty I might have felt toward her. I scrolled through the remaining images, verifying the dates and the minimum payment warnings printed in bold red ink. The most recent statement indicated that the bank was preparing to send her accounts to a hostile collections agency by the end of the month. She was completely out of time. That explained her absolute lack of empathy in the kitchen this morning. Her cold demand that I sign the papers to keep the peace was actually a desperate demand to save her from personal financial ruin. She needed me to surrender so she could continue pretending to be wealthy. I connected the digital camera to my encrypted flash drive using a small cable. I transferred every single image of her credit card statements into a separate, secure folder on the drive. I labeled the folder with her full name, marking it as a high-priority target for my attorney. I organized the files meticulously, ensuring that every receipt and every overdue notice was perfectly legible. Bradley would face federal prison for his corporate crimes, but Allison's punishment would be entirely different and far more personal. I was going to strip away the only thing she actually cared about in this world. I was going to let her drown under the crushing weight of her own vanity. When the federal authorities seized Bradley assets to repay the stolen pensions, Allison would be left completely alone, holding $80,000 of unsecured debt, with absolutely no income and no safety net. I slipped the encrypted drive back into the inner pocket of my borrowed wool cardigan. The intelligence-gathering phase of my operation was officially complete. I had uncovered the tax fraud, the stolen pensions, and the secret luxury debt. I had the weapon, and I had the ammunition required to completely dismantle their lives. I leaned back against the cold concrete wall of the basement and waited for the sun to set. The evening was rapidly approaching, and the daily family dinner would serve as the perfect battlefield. I needed to push Bradley completely over the edge to make him feel the absolute desperation of his situation. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing, letting the cold military precision wash over me. The time for gathering evidence was over. The time for active psychological warfare had officially begun. The grandfather clock in the main hallway chimed 7 times, echoing heavily through the suffocating silence of the estate. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany dining table, perfectly maintaining the hunched posture of my twin brother. Allison sat at the opposite end, staring blankly at her expensive smartphone. She had ordered premium dinner from a high-end local steakhouse, completely unwilling to cook and desperately trying to maintain her illusion of domestic normalcy. A thick, perfectly seared ribeye steak rested on the porcelain plate in front of me, alongside roasted asparagus and garlic potatoes. It was a meal paid for by the very credit cards I knew were about to be permanently declined. I picked up my silver knife and fork, holding them with a slight, manufactured tremor. I was not nervous. I was entirely calm. My mind was completely clear, operating with the cold, absolute precision of a military tactician preparing for a decisive nighttime engagement. I slowly cut a piece of the rich meat, chewing it with deliberate focus. I was restoring my physical strength, waiting patiently for the enemy commander to return to the battlefield and realize he had already lost the war. The heavy front door suddenly violently crashed open. The sound of the solid wood slamming against the drywall sent a sharp echo through the first floor. Allison jumped in her chair, dropping her phone onto the table with a loud clatter. Heavy, frantic footsteps pounded across the imported Brazilian hardwood of the foyer. Bradley Mitchell had finally returned from the financial district. He did not walk into the dining room. He stormed into the space like a wounded, aggressive animal. His appearance had completely degraded since the morning. His expensive, tailored suit jacket was missing. His silk tie was completely gone, and the top 3 buttons of his designer shirt were ripped open, exposing his flushed, sweating chest. His hair was entirely disheveled, and his face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with the absolute panic of a man who had spent the entire afternoon watching his fraudulent empire burn to the ground. He marched directly toward my end of the table, stopping just inches from my chair. He planted his hands firmly on the polished mahogany, leaning his massive frame over me to project maximum physical dominance. He did not ask me any questions. He launched directly into a violent, screaming tirade. His voice was hoarse and grating, vibrating with a terrifying desperation. He screamed that the bank manager had officially locked him out of the entire retirement portfolio. He yelled that the federal fraud algorithms had permanently frozen his primary corporate logistics accounts, preventing him from paying his drivers or his fuel vendors. He blamed me entirely for the catastrophic failure of his business. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my face, and declared that my stubbornness at the bank had ruined his life. He demanded that I stand up immediately. He screamed that he was completely done dealing with a useless, parasitic old man. He ordered me to go down to the damp basement, pack my single cheap suitcase, and get out of his house immediately. He told me I was officially evicted and that I would be sleeping on the cold concrete sidewalk tonight. He threatened that if I did not walk out the front door voluntarily in the next 5 minutes, he would physically drag me by my gray hair and throw me onto the front lawn. I did not flinch. I did not shrink back into my chair. I did not drop my silver utensils. I simply continued cutting my steak. I sliced another piece of the perfectly cooked meat, completely ignoring the massive screaming man towering over me. The psychological impact of my total apathy was immediate and profound. Predators rely entirely on the fear of their victims to sustain their own power. When you deny them that fear, their entire reality begins to fracture. I slowly raised the fork to my mouth and took a bite. I chewed the meat deliberately, tasting the rich, savory juices. I swallowed, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on my porcelain plate. I reached for my linen napkin and carefully dabbed the corners of my mouth. Only then did I slowly look up at him. I kept the reading glasses perched on my nose, but I allowed a fraction of the cold, retired military investigator to bleed through the disguise. I did not raise my voice. I spoke in a steady, flat whisper that sliced through his chaotic screaming like a razor blade. I told him I was not going to the basement to pack a suitcase. I told him I was not walking out the front door, and he was certainly not going to drag me anywhere. Bradley opened his mouth to scream another threat, but I instantly cut him off. I informed him that he fundamentally misunderstood the legal reality of the ground he was currently standing on. I explained that this estate was not his property, and it had never been his property. I told him that 5 years ago, the deed to this entire property was legally transferred into an irrevocable, protected blind trust. I explained that I retained a permanent ironclad life estate residency clause. I told him he and Allison were legally classified as nothing more than temporary permitted guests. I watched the arrogant fury in his eyes slowly morph into profound, terrified confusion as the legal terms washed over him. I leaned back slightly in my chair, resting my hands on the armrests. I delivered the absolute finality of his situation with cold, mechanical precision. I told him that because of my protected legal status in this house, he had absolutely zero authority to evict me. I explained that local tenancy laws explicitly protected senior citizens from sudden hostile evictions. I told him that if he wanted me removed, he would have to file a formal petition in civil court. I informed him that the current legal backlog for a contested trust eviction was exactly 6 months. I looked directly into his bloodshot eyes and told him that if he even attempted to lay a single finger on me to physically remove me from the premises, it would instantly be classified as a felony assault on a protected elder. I told him the police would arrive within minutes, and he would spend the night in a concrete holding cell while his bankrupt logistics company completely collapsed. I stated clearly that he was trapped in this house with me, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to change it. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and terrifying. Bradley's brain completely short-circuited. He was a man who solved every problem in his life through financial theft or physical violence. I had just flawlessly neutralized both of his primary weapons. He was financially starved and legally paralyzed. He stared at me, his jaw clenching so hard I could hear the teeth grinding together in his mouth. The absolute impotence of his rage became too much for his fragile ego to contain. He needed to destroy something. He reached out with lightning speed and grabbed his heavy crystal water glass from the table. He let out a loud guttural roar and hurled the glass with maximum force directly at the dining room wall. The heavy crystal shattered violently upon impact, sending sharp, jagged shards of glass raining down onto the hardwood floor. Allison let out a piercing, terrified scream, covering her face with her hands and shrinking back into her chair. I did not blink. I did not move a single muscle. I simply picked up my silver knife and fork again, cut another piece of my ribeye steak, and continued eating my dinner in complete silence. The domestic tension had reached an absolute breaking point, and the monster was finally beginning to eat himself alive. I waited until the house was completely silent before slipping out the back door. The shattered crystal still lay on the dining room floor, a physical reminder of the breaking point I had engineered. I walked 3 miles through the quiet suburban streets, ensuring no one followed me before catching a cab to a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of the city. The neon sign buzzed erratically, casting a harsh red glow across the empty parking lot. I walked inside and slid into a sticky vinyl booth in the far back corner. Carter Reed was already waiting for me. He wore a sharp black suit that looked entirely out of place against the faded Formica table. Carter was not just a corporate litigator. 30 years ago, he was a young intelligence officer under my direct command during a highly classified overseas deployment. I had pulled him out of a burning transport vehicle, dragging him to safety while under heavy hostility fire. He owed me his life, and he repaid that debt by becoming the most ruthless legal predator in the state. He did not offer a warm greeting or ask about my retirement. We operated on a frequency of absolute efficiency. He pushed a cup of black coffee across the table toward me. I reached into the inner pocket of my borrowed wool cardigan and pulled out the encrypted flash drive. I placed it gently on the table between us. I told him the drive contained exactly what I promised on the phone. I explained that it held the complete dual ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, and the fake vendor invoices. I told him Bradley Mitchell was actively dodging federal corporate taxes and hiding the stolen revenue in shell accounts registered exclusively to his wife. Carter picked up the small piece of plastic, turning it over in his hands. A cold, professional smile touched the corners of his mouth. He said tax evasion was a solid angle that would easily freeze their assets and trigger a massive federal audit. He said it was enough to completely ruin their business and seize their property, but perhaps not quite enough to guarantee maximum prison time for a first-time white-collar offender. I took a slow sip of the bitter coffee and leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. I told him the tax fraud was only the appetizer. I instructed him to open the secondary folder labeled with the internal company codes. I explained that I had breached a hidden floor safe in the master bedroom and photographed the physical accounting books. I told him Bradley was systematically embezzling the retirement pension funds of his own truck drivers and warehouse workers to float his failing logistics company. The professional smile completely vanished from Carter, face replaced by a look of sheer legal anticipation. Stealing from the federal government was one thing, but stealing working-class pensions was a guaranteed ticket to decades in a federal penitentiary. Juries and judges possessed zero sympathy for wealthy executives who robbed their own employees to buy luxury sports cars. Carter pulled a sleek silver laptop from his leather briefcase and plugged the encrypted drive directly into the port. He typed in the decryption key I provided and watched as the massive trove of stolen data populated his screen. His eyes darted back and forth across the spreadsheets, rapidly processing the sheer magnitude of the financial carnage. I did not stop there. I told Carter to open the final folder bearing my niece's name. I explained that Allison was fully complicit in the financial crimes, actively protecting the stolen assets, while simultaneously accumulating over $80,000 in secret, unsecured luxury credit card debt. I told him she was expecting her father estate to pay off her designer shoes and mountain vacations. Carter scrolled through the high-resolution photographs of the overdue billing statements and the final notice warnings. He looked up at me, his eyes narrowing with calculated precision. He asked exactly how I wanted the execution carried out. I told him I wanted a synchronized total destruction. I did not want them to have a single second to breathe or coordinate a legal defense. I wanted the financial, the legal, and the criminal consequences to hit them simultaneously from every possible direction. Carter nodded slowly, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he began drafting the legal guillotine. He explained his strategy with cold, mechanical efficiency. First, He would submit the tax fraud evidence directly to a specialized contact he maintained within the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. He guaranteed the federal agents would immediately freeze every single corporate and personal account bearing Bradley or Allison's social security numbers by tomorrow morning. They would be entirely locked out of their own stolen money before they even woke up. Next, Carter explained he would anonymously forward the photographed pension ledgers to the Federal Labor Board and the State Financial Crimes Unit. He would request an immediate emergency injunction, citing the active destruction of employee retirement funds. This would prompt a sudden unannounced raid on the logistics company headquarters and the private estate. The authorities would arrive with a warrant to rip up the master bedroom floor and seize the physical safe. Finally, Carter drafted a formal legal notice regarding the $80,000 in luxury debt. He prepared a document explicitly severing my brother's legal and financial ties to his daughter, ensuring that her creditors could never attempt to attach her massive debt to his protected trust. Carter promised to anonymously forward her financial insolvency data directly to her premium credit card companies. This action would instantly trigger hostile collections and immediate asset repossession. Carter hit the final keystroke and closed his silver laptop with a sharp click. He looked at me and said the dominoes were officially in motion. By 9:00 tomorrow morning, Bradley Mitchell would be a man without a company, without a bank account, and without a future. I finished the rest of my bitter coffee and stood up from the vinyl booth. I thanked Carter for his swift execution. He simply nodded, stating it was an honor to serve with me again. I walked out of the diner and into the cold night air. I had laid the ultimate trap, and now I simply had to return to the estate and play the defeated old man one last time to ensure Bradley walked willingly into his own total annihilation. I walked the remaining distance from the main road back to the sprawling brick estate. The night air had grown significantly colder, but the chill did not bother me at all. My mind was completely insulated by the tactical perfection of the trap Carter Reed and I had just finished setting at the diner. I approached the heavy front door, stepping carefully over the threshold to avoid making any unnecessary noise. The house was entirely dark, except for a single dim light spilling from the formal living room down the hallway. The silence inside the estate was thick and heavy, vibrating with the unresolved violence of the dinner confrontation. I stopped in the foyer and took a slow, deep breath to completely reset my physical posture. I let my shoulders drop entirely, allowing my spine to curve forward into a permanent slouch. I willed my hands to shake slightly, and I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I was about to deliver the performance of my life. I had completely cornered an aggressive predator financially and legally, and now I needed to open the cage door just wide enough to make him think he had found a miraculous escape route. I shuffled slowly toward the living room, dragging my feet audibly against the imported hardwood floor, ensuring he heard my pathetic approach. Bradley was sitting heavily in a large leather armchair in the corner of the room. He had not changed his ruined clothes from earlier. He held a thick crystal glass of dark amber liquor in his hand, resting it against his chest. The shattered glass from the dining room had not been cleaned up, leaving a dangerous mess on the floor nearby. He stared blankly at the unlit stone fireplace, completely consumed by the impending collapse of his logistics company and his massive financial fraud. When he heard my shuffling footsteps, he slowly turned his heavy head. His eyes were bloodshot from the alcohol and completely hollow from the stress. He did not immediately yell or jump out of his chair. The absolute legal paralysis I had inflicted upon him during dinner had temporarily drained his aggressive physical energy. He simply glared at me with a mixture of pure hatred and desperate exhaustion. I walked into the room, keeping my head bowed entirely, avoiding direct eye contact. I stopped a few feet away from his chair and let out a long, trembling sigh. I wrapped my arms around my torso, shivering slightly, as if the weight of the world had finally crushed my spirit completely. I looked like a man who had entirely given up on life. I looked exactly like the broken victim he desperately needed me to be. I spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, letting the words crack and falter with manufactured grief. I told him I could not do this anymore. I told him the severe stress was going to trigger a fatal heart attack, and I simply wanted the screaming and the fighting to stop before it killed me. I looked down at the expensive Persian rug and said the exact words he had been violently demanding to hear for 6 agonizing months. I told him he could have the house. I explained that while I was out walking to clear my head, I had called the primary executor of my blind trust and instructed them to completely dissolve the protective residency clause. I lied with absolute flawless conviction, stating that the legal paperwork was being rushed through the system tonight to release the property deed back into my direct control. I told him I was willing to sign the entire estate over to him and Allison unconditionally, just to buy my own peace of mind and secure a quiet place in a state-run nursing home. Bradley slowly lowered his glass of liquor to a small side table. The dull, exhausted look in his eyes instantly vanished, replaced by a sharp, predatory gleam. His brain desperately latched onto this sudden, miraculous lifeline. He leaned forward, his posture shifting rapidly from defeat back to arrogant dominance. He asked me if I was telling the truth, his voice thick with aggressive suspicion. I nodded slowly, wiping a fake tear from my cheek with a trembling hand. I told him I would prove it to him tomorrow morning. I instructed him to call his personal corporate lawyer immediately and have him bring the official transfer documents directly to our dining room table at exactly 9:00. I said I would sign every single page in front of his legal witness, and then I would pack my small suitcase and leave the property forever. The bait was perfectly presented, and Bradley swallowed it whole. His massive ego completely blinded him to the tactical reality of the situation. He did not question why a man who had flawlessly defeated him just a few hours ago would suddenly surrender without a fight. He simply believed that his aggressive intimidation tactics had finally broken my psychological resolve. He believed he was the superior man. A sickening, triumphant smile spread across his flushed, sweaty face. He stood up from the leather chair, towering over me once again. He sneered down at me, calling me a pathetic, weak coward. He told me it was about time I remembered my place in his house. He promised his lawyer would be here first thing in the morning, and he warned me not to try any more stupid tricks, or he would still throw me down the stairs. I kept my head down, offering a weak, submissive nod. I turned around and slowly shuffled back toward the basement stairs, playing the broken accountant, all the way down into the dark, damp room. I lay down on the rusty cot and smiled in the pitch black. He thought he had just won the entire war. He had absolutely no idea he had just agreed to attend his own execution. Morning sunlight filtered through the large glass windows of the estate, casting long, bright shadows across the imported hardwood floors. The atmosphere inside the house had completely transformed overnight. The heavy, suffocating tension was gone, replaced by the toxic, buzzing energy of unearned victory. I remained in the damp basement, sitting on the edge of the rusty cot, listening to the heavy, confident footsteps echoing from the master bedroom directly above me. Bradley Mitchell was awake, and he was actively celebrating his perceived triumph. I could hear him humming a cheerful, tuneless melody as he moved around his luxurious bathroom. He was taking a long, hot shower, washing away the panic and the terror that had consumed him yesterday afternoon. He truly believed he had won the war. He believed that his aggressive screaming and his physical intimidation had finally broken my psychological resolve completely. He was putting on a fresh, tailored suit, preparing to meet his corrupt corporate lawyer and force me to sign away the very roof over my head. He walked downstairs and entered the sprawling designer kitchen. I heard the expensive espresso machine grinding fresh coffee beans. Allison joined him a few minutes later, her high heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. I could hear the smug satisfaction in her voice as she discussed her plans to hire an interior decorator to completely remodel my basement room, the moment I was thrown out onto the street. They were moving with the arrogant swagger of conquering royalty, entirely blind to the fact that their kingdom was currently burning to the ground all around them. Miles away in the cold concrete heart of the downtown financial district, Carter Reed was already operating with lethal military efficiency. He did not sleep. He had spent the entire night finalizing the digital and physical packages of absolute legal destruction. At exactly 7 in the morning, he walked into a secure, federal courier facility. He did not wear his expensive tailored suits, preferring to blend into the early morning crowd in a simple gray overcoat. He paid the courier clerk entirely in cash. He handed over a thick, sealed manila envelope containing the high-resolution photographs of the physical ledgers I had extracted from the master bedroom safe. The package was addressed directly to the Emergency Investigative Director of the State Labor Board. It contained undeniable proof that Bradley was systematically siphoning the retirement pension funds of his own working-class employees. Carter had meticulously highlighted every single fraudulent transfer, indexing the stolen amounts against the names of the innocent truck drivers and warehouse workers. 5 minutes later, Carter sat in his parked car and opened his sleek silver laptop. Connecting through a secure, untraceable, encrypted network, he uploaded the digital tax fraud files directly to a priority portal at the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Division. He included the fake vendor invoices, the dual corporate ledgers, and the offshore routing numbers registered exclusively to Allison. The evidence was not circumstantial or based on hearsay. It was absolute, irrefutable, and perfectly organized to guarantee maximum legal devastation. Bureaucracy is typically a slow and lumbering machine, but when it is presented with perfectly organized, undeniable proof of massive ongoing financial theft, it can move with terrifying speed. By 8:15 in the morning, a senior forensic accountant at the Internal Revenue Service opened the encrypted file Carter had transmitted. The federal agent took one look at the dual ledgers and the offshore shell accounts and immediately flagged the file for emergency administrative intervention. Tax evasion on a corporate level is a serious offense, but the accompanying evidence of employee pension embezzlement triggered an absolute zero-tolerance protocol within the agency. Federal judges do not hesitate when working-class retirement funds are actively being drained to fund a luxury lifestyle. Within 30 minutes, an emergency federal injunction was drafted, signed and digitally transmitted across the entire national banking network. The massive, invisible gears of the federal justice system engaged, completely locking their steel jaws around Bradley Mitchell and his fraudulent empire. The State Labor Board moved with equal ferocity, dispatching a team of investigators to coordinate directly with local law enforcement. Every single corporate logistics account, every personal checking account, and every hidden offshore asset bearing the name of Bradley or Allison was instantly and permanently frozen. The financial guillotine had dropped completely, severing them from their stolen wealth. The real-world consequences hit his logistics company like a catastrophic earthquake at exactly 8:45. Across the city, at the main dispatch terminal for Mitchell Logistics, a fleet manager attempted to authorize a massive routine purchase of diesel fuel for a convoy of 10 long-haul delivery trucks. The commercial vendor terminal flashed a bright red error code indicating a hard decline. The frustrated manager tried a secondary corporate credit line, assuming it was a simple bank error. It was also violently rejected. Panic began to spread rapidly through the dispatch office as the accounting department realized their administrative access to the primary payroll accounts had been completely revoked. The digital screens on their desks displayed a terrifying zero balance accompanied by a severe federal freeze notification. The company was financially dead in the water. The massive delivery trucks could not move a single inch. The warehouse workers began to murmur as the horrifying rumors of frozen pensions and missing retirement funds swept across the cold concrete loading docks. Chaos erupted, entirely consuming the business he had built on a foundation of lies and extortion. Back at the sprawling brick estate, Bradley stood in his kitchen, sipping his premium espresso. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket as it began to vibrate frantically against his leg. It was his dispatch manager calling desperately to report the total financial collapse. Bradley glanced at the screen, saw the office caller identification, and simply pressed the ignore button. He was far too busy admiring his reflection in the kitchen window, waiting for his lawyer to arrive and finalize his absolute dominance over a frail old man. His phone immediately began to vibrate again, followed by a flood of urgent text messages from his accounting team. He let out an annoyed sigh and completely silenced his device, slipping it back into his tailored suit pocket. He willfully ignored the frantic alarm bells of his own total destruction, completely obsessed with the illusion of his impending victory. At precisely 9:00, the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the foyer. I remained seated on the edge of the basement cot, listening to the heavy footsteps above me. Bradley practically ran to answer the door. I heard the muffled exchange of enthusiastic greetings. He had brought his corporate attorney to the estate to officiate my complete surrender and legitimize his theft. I waited exactly 3 minutes, letting them settle into the dining room, and spread their paperwork across the table before I began my slow, agonizing ascent up the wooden stairs. I kept my shoulders perfectly hunched and my breathing shallow, dragging my feet against the wood. I walked into the dining room and found them waiting for me at the long mahogany table. The shattered crystal from last night had been hastily swept into a corner, but the dark stain of spilled liquor still marred the expensive Persian rug. Bradley stood at the head of the table, radiating an arrogant, toxic energy. His tailored suit was crisp and his hair was perfectly styled, hiding the desperate panic he had displayed the night before. Beside him sat a man who looked entirely out of place in a domestic setting. The lawyer wore a flashy pinstripe suit, a silk tie, and a gold watch that cost more than my brother earned in a decade. He had slicked back dark hair and a predatory smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. He was exactly the kind of sleazy legal mercenary Bradley would hire to legally extort a terrified senior citizen. He looked at me with absolute disgust, clearly viewing me as nothing more than a minor administrative obstacle. I pulled out a heavy wooden chair and sat down slowly, keeping my eyes firmly fixed on the polished surface of the table. I let my hands rest in my lap, ensuring they trembled just enough to complete the illusion of absolute defeat. The lawyer did not bother offering a polite greeting or introducing himself. He simply reached into his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He slapped the papers onto the table with a loud, authoritative thud. He slid them across the mahogany until they rested directly in front of me. He pulled a heavy silver pen from his breast pocket and placed it meticulously beside the documents. He began to speak in a rapid, condescending tone, intentionally using complex legal jargon designed to confuse and intimidate an elderly man. He explained that by signing the bottom of each page, I was permanently dissolving my life estate residency clause and transferring absolute legal ownership of the entire property to Bradley and Allison. He told me the process was entirely irreversible and that I was legally acknowledging my immediate eviction from the premises without any financial compensation. Bradley leaned over the table, placing his thick hands flat against the wood. He could barely contain his malicious excitement. He commanded me to pick up the pen and sign the papers so he could finally be rid of my pathetic existence. He told me my taxi was already waiting outside to take me to a cheap motel downtown and that I was never allowed to contact his wife again. I did not reach for the silver pen. I did not look at the stack of extortion papers. The time for playing the frightened accountant had officially come to an end. I sat perfectly still, allowing a heavy, suffocating silence to fill the dining room. I slowly straightened my spine, pressing my back firmly against the wooden chair. I rolled my shoulders back instantly, shedding the physical posture of the victim. I raised my head and looked directly into the eyes of the sleazy corporate attorney. The sudden absolute transformation of my physical presence caught him completely off guard. His predatory smile faltered slightly, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I reached inside the inner pocket of my borrowed wool cardigan and extracted the thick, sealed manila folder Carter Reed had prepared for me. I placed it onto the table and slid it slowly across the polished mahogany until it completely covered the fraudulent property deed. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the cold, mechanical authority of a military investigator delivering a final verdict. I told the lawyer that I would not be signing his documents today or any other day. I instructed him to open the folder I had just given him and review the actual legal reality of his client before he committed career suicide by associating with him. Bradley slammed his fist against the table, demanding to know what kind of stupid game I was playing. The attorney ignored him. The instinct of a legal predator is self-preservation above all else. He reached out and opened the manila cover. The very first page was the emergency federal injunction issued by the Internal Revenue Service just 1 hour ago. The second page was a detailed summary of the dual corporate ledgers and the offshore shell accounts displaying the exact amounts stolen from the government. The third page contained the high-resolution photographs of the physical accounting books, proving the systematic embezzlement of the employee pension funds. I watched the arrogant color rapidly drain from the lawyer face, leaving him a sickly shade of pale gray. His eyes widened in absolute terror as he processed the sheer magnitude of the federal crimes his client had committed. He knew instantly that these were not empty threats or civil disputes. This was a guaranteed federal indictment with mandatory prison sentences. He knew that if he remained in this house for 1 more minute, or actively tried to enforce a property transfer for a man under federal investigation, he could be legally implicated as an accessory to massive corporate fraud and disbarred permanently. The attorney did not say a single word to Bradley. He frantically shoved the documents back into the folder. He grabbed his silver pen and his empty leather briefcase. He stood up so fast his chair tipped backward and crashed onto the hardwood floor. He practically sprinted out of the dining room, his expensive leather shoes sliding frantically against the foyer floorboards. The heavy front door slammed shut behind him, leaving Bradley standing alone in completely stunned silence. Bradley stared at the empty space where his lawyer had just been sitting. His brain simply could not comprehend what had just happened. He looked down at the manila folder resting on the table. He reached out with trembling fingers and pulled it toward him. He flipped the cover open, and his eyes landed directly on the bright red federal audit seal stamped across the top of the Internal Revenue Service injunction. He read the summary of his stolen pension funds and the exact routing numbers of his hidden offshore accounts. He saw the photographs of his own secret safe. The arrogant swagger completely vanished from his massive frame. His knees buckled slightly, and he collapsed heavily into the chair beside him. He looked up at me, his bloodshot eyes wide with a horrifying realization. He finally understood that he had never been in control. He finally understood that every single scream, every threat, and every act of physical violence had simply tightened the noose I had deliberately placed around his neck. He was completely trapped, and the authorities were already on their way. I sat perfectly still, watching the monster realize he was completely and utterly destroyed. The silence in the dining room hung heavy and suffocating. Bradley stared at this bright red federal audit seal stamped across the top of the Internal Revenue Service injunction. His mind struggled to process the absolute finality of the document. The wealth he had stolen, the business he had built on lies, and the power he had wielded over his family were completely gone. The realization did not bring him to a place of remorse or surrender. For a man like Bradley Mitchell, the sudden loss of control only triggered a deep, primal violence. He slowly looked up from the manila folder. The terrified confusion in his bloodshot eyes hardened into a dark, murderous glare. He stared at me sitting calmly across the polished mahogany table, and his fragile ego completely shattered. He did not see a brilliant tactician who had flawlessly dismantled his life. He only saw the frail accountant he had abused for 6 months. He firmly believed he could simply beat the problem into submission, just like he always did. A low, guttural growl built in the back of his throat. His massive hands balled into tight, heavy fists. He did not bother walking around the long dining table. He exploded upward from his chair with the blind, frantic energy of a cornered predator. He kicked his chair backward, sending it crashing onto the hardwood floor, and threw his entire massive body directly across the polished wood. His arms reached out, his thick fingers hooked like claws, aiming straight for my throat. He intended to strangle the life out of me right there in his own dining room, believing that silencing me would somehow stop the federal machinery I had already set in motion. He was completely blinded by his own rage, abandoning all logic and self-preservation. He moved with the raw, aggressive power of a much younger man, fueled by the absolute desperation of his collapsing reality. The heavy mahogany table groaned under his shifting weight as he scrambled across the center, scattering the remaining legal documents onto the floor. He expected me to cower. He expected me to raise my hands in a pathetic defensive gesture and beg for my life, just as my brother had done at the bottom of the basement stairs. He made the final and most devastating miscalculation of his entire pathetic existence. I did not shrink back into my chair. I did not break eye contact. The terrified accountant persona instantly evaporated entirely, replaced by the cold, mechanical precision of a seasoned military investigator. I stood up, moving with a terrifying fluid speed that his alcohol-soaked brain simply could not comprehend. I did not retreat. I stepped directly into the path of his violent assault. As his heavy hands lunged for my neck, I brought my left forearm up in a sharp, brutal block, deflecting his entire body weight away from my center line. I grabbed the collar of his tailored suit jacket with my right hand, using his own forward momentum against him. I pivoted my hips, dropping my center of gravity, and pulled him violently forward while simultaneously driving my left forearm into the back of his neck. The force of the counterattack completely neutralized his aggressive energy. Bradley slammed face down onto the hard, polished mahogany with a sickening thud. The breath exploded from his lungs in a wet, ragged gasp. Before he could even attempt to recover or push himself up, I applied a secondary military compliance hold. I twisted his right arm painfully behind his back, locking his wrist against his shoulder blade. I pressed my left hand firmly against the base of his skull, leaning my entire upper body weight directly into his cervical spine. I applied precise, calculated pressure, just enough to cause blinding, agonizing pain without breaking the bone. He was entirely paralyzed, pinned flat against the wood like a dissected specimen. He let out a high-pitched whimper of absolute agony, his cheek pressed hard against the very legal documents that condemned him. He kicked his legs uselessly against the side of the table, completely stripped of his false dominance. The physical domination was absolute, but the psychological destruction was just beginning. I maintained the lethal pressure on his neck, forcing his face flush against the cold wood. He was panting heavily, drool spilling from the corner of his mouth, pooling on the federal injunction papers. I leaned down, pressing my face close to his ear. I did not yell. I did not gloat. I spoke in a low, steady whisper that carried the absolute finality of a judge delivering a death sentence. I told him he had made a fatal mistake, assuming my brother was entirely alone in this world. I felt his massive frame tense in absolute terror under my grip as my tone of voice completely changed. I no longer sounded like a frightened victim. I sounded exactly like the lethal operator I had been for 30 years. I leaned closer and whispered the absolute truth directly into his mind. I told him Henry is completely safe. I told him I am Jack. I told him he was completely out of time. The words hit him harder than any physical blow ever could. I felt a violent shudder rack his entire body as the horrifying realization finally clicked into place. He understood in that exact moment that he had not been fighting an old accountant. He had spent the last 24 hours actively picking a fight with a military investigator who had spent decades destroying actual monsters. He realized that the frail, trembling old man he had bullied and shoved was a carefully constructed illusion designed specifically to trap him. A deep, pathetic sob broke free from his throat. It was the sound of a completely broken man mourning the sudden, violent death of his own arrogance. He stopped struggling against my grip. His muscles went completely slack, surrendering entirely to the agonizing pain in his shoulder and his neck. He lay pinned against the mahogany table, a defeated parasite waiting for the inevitable arrival of the authorities. The silent adjustment was officially complete, and the predator had become the prey. I kept my forearm pressed firmly against the back of his neck, pinning him flat against the table. The heavy mahogany wood felt cold beneath his sweating face. Bradley was completely paralyzed by the physical pain and the devastating psychological realization that his entire life was over. He did not attempt to struggle anymore. He just breathed in ragged, shallow gasps. The suffocating silence in the dining room was suddenly broken by a faint, high-pitched wail echoing from the main road. The sound grew louder and more distinct with every passing second, multiplying into a massive chorus of aggressive mechanical screams. Flashing red and blue lights began to stroke the walls of the dining room, piercing through the expensive silk curtains and illuminating the scattered legal documents on the floor. The cavalry had arrived exactly on schedule. Carter Reed had promised a synchronized destruction, and my former subordinate never missed a deadline. I leaned my weight into Bradley one last time, ensuring he felt the absolute finality of the moment. I told him his ride was finally here, and he was never coming back to this house. The flashing lights painted his pale, terrified face in alternating shades of crimson and sapphire, exposing the absolute cowardice hiding beneath his tailored suit. The heavy tires of multiple large vehicles screeched loudly against the circular asphalt driveway right outside the front window. The bright strobing lights transformed the luxurious foyer into a chaotic disco of law enforcement colors. Heavy boots pounded against the concrete front steps with terrifying synchronization. I could hear the loud, authoritative voices of federal agents coordinating with local police officers, forming an inescapable perimeter around the massive brick estate. Upstairs, a heavy door slammed open. Allison began to scream, her voice shrill and completely unhinged. She pounded down the wooden staircase, her high heels snapping aggressively against the steps. She stopped dead in the middle of the foyer, staring through the front windows at the army of black and blue uniforms surrounding her perfect house. Before she could even process the nightmare unfolding on her manicured lawn, the heavy front door was violently breached. The brass lock completely shattered under the massive impact of a steel battering ram, sending splinters of expensive wood flying across the imported hardwood floor. A swarm of armed federal agents and local police officers flooded into the house, their weapons drawn, and their voices echoing with absolute authority, demanding everyone show their hands. They swept through the foyer, securing the perimeter, and immediately moved toward the dining room. The lead federal agent stepped into the dining room, his sharp eyes rapidly sweeping the chaotic scene. He saw the shattered crystal from last night, the scattered extortion paperwork, and the massive man pinned face down on the table. I did not wait for him to shout a command. I slowly released the excruciating pressure on Bradley's cervical spine and stepped back, raising my hands smoothly into the air to show I was entirely unarmed and compliant. I completely dropped the aggressive military posture and immediately reverted to a calm, cooperative civilian. I looked directly at the lead agent and calmly stated my name and my retired military identification number. I told him I was the authorized representative for Henry Sullivan and the primary source of the evidence submitted by Carter Reed. The agent instantly recognized the name of the prominent corporate attorney who had initiated the federal raid. He holstered his weapon and nodded, signaling 2 local police officers to move forward. They grabbed Bradley by his ruined suit jacket and violently hauled him off the mahogany table. Bradley's legs gave out completely, and he collapsed onto his knees in the center of the room. A broken, pathetic shell of a man completely stripped of his unearned power. The officers did not show him a single ounce of the respect he believed he deserved. They wrenched his thick arms roughly behind his back, snapping heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. The sharp metallic click echoed through the silent dining room, sounding like the closing of a heavy vault door. The lead federal agent stood directly over him, pulling a thick warrant from his tactical vest. The agent read the criminal charges aloud, his voice booming through the house. He listed massive corporate tax evasion, wire fraud, and the systematic embezzlement of employee pension funds. A local police detective stepped forward immediately, adding the severe state charges of felony domestic battery and elder abuse based on the brutal injuries inflicted upon my twin brother. Bradley did not argue. He did not scream or demand his sleazy corporate lawyer. He simply hung his head, weeping openly, as the authorities dragged him across his own expensive Persian rug. Allison stood completely paralyzed in the hallway, watching her primary source of unearned wealth being hauled away in steel chains. The flashing lights illuminated the sheer terror on her face as her perfect toxic bubble was completely destroyed. The wealthy neighbors were undoubtedly standing on their manicured lawns watching the arrogant executive being shoved into the back of a police cruiser. His freedom, his reputation, and his arrogant empire were completely eradicated in a matter of minutes. The heavy wooden door stood wide open, framing the chaotic scene on the front lawn. I watched the taillights of the police cruisers disappear down the quiet suburban street, taking Bradley Mitchell entirely out of my life. The flashing red and blue lights faded into the morning mist, leaving the sprawling brick estate in a state of absolute ruined silence. The federal agents had secured the physical safe upstairs and departed with their evidence boxes, leaving the house feeling hollow and completely exposed. I turned away from the shattered front entrance and looked at the woman standing trembling in the center of the foyer. Allison was completely frozen. Her perfect silk morning robe hung loosely from her shoulders, and her expensive espresso rested completely forgotten on the kitchen island. She stared at the empty driveway, her mouth slightly open, unable to comprehend how her luxurious kingdom had just evaporated in less than 15 minutes. She slowly turned her head and locked her frantic eyes on me. The shock holding her together suddenly fractured completely, replaced by a hysterical, desperate rage. She marched into the dining room, her high heels crunching loudly over the shattered crystal I had deliberately left on the floor. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at my chest and began to scream. Her voice was shrill and completely unhinged, bouncing harshly off the vaulted ceilings. She demanded to know what I had done. She screamed that I had ruined her marriage and destroyed her social standing. She ordered me to pick up the telephone immediately and call Mr. Sterling at the bank. She commanded me to wire my entire $2 million retirement portfolio to a federal bail bondsman to get her husband out of jail. She was entirely, completely delusional. She had just watched federal agents arrest her husband for stealing working-class pensions, and her only concern was how fast she could force her abused father to buy back her comfortable illusion. She did not shed a single tear for the innocent people Bradley had robbed. She only wept for her own impending poverty. I let her scream until her throat went completely hoarse. I stood perfectly still, absorbing her toxic tantrum with the cold detachment of a stone wall. When she finally ran out of breath, panting heavily and glaring at me with pure venom, I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my borrowed wool cardigan. I did not pull out a phone. I pulled out a thick, bound stack of paper. It was the complete dossier of photocopies I had meticulously gathered from the hidden floor safe last night. I tossed the heavy stack onto the polished mahogany table. The papers fanned out across the wood, coming to rest directly in front of her trembling hands. I kept my voice entirely flat, completely devoid of any paternal warmth or sympathy. I told her to look at the papers. I commanded her to look very closely at the exact price tag of her own soul. Allison looked down at the table. Her eyes darted across the glossy copies of her premium credit card statements. She saw the highlighted balances totaling over $80,000 in unsecured luxury debt. She saw the final notice warnings and the impending collections threats printed in bold black ink. All the aggressive energy completely drained from her body. Her knees buckled slightly, and she caught herself against the edge of the dining table. She looked up at me, her face completely devoid of color. She stammered, asking how I got those documents. She whispered that Bradley was supposed to pay those accounts this week using the corporate logistics funds. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I did not slouch, and I did not tremble. I stood tall, projecting the absolute authority of a man who had just orchestrated the total destruction of her life. I told her the corporate funds were completely frozen by the federal government and would be entirely seized to repay the stolen employee pensions. I told her the blind trust protecting my brother's wealth was legally sealed and entirely impenetrable. I looked directly into her terrified eyes and told her that her father was never going to pay for her designer handbags or her mountain vacations ever again. I explained with brutal clarity that she was entirely financially alone. I told her the creditors would begin hunting her by tomorrow morning. They would repossess her luxury vehicle. They would seize her expensive jewelry, and they would completely obliterate her perfect social credit score. She began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest, as the crushing weight of her reality finally suffocated her. She begged me to help her. She called me dad and pleaded for a second chance, crying real tears of absolute desperation. The sound of her pleading brought me absolutely zero joy, but it brought me a profound sense of justice. I leaned slightly forward and delivered the final, absolute consequence of her betrayal. I told her she lost the right to ask for my help the exact moment she stood in the kitchen and watched Bradley throw her father down the basement stairs. I told her silence was a choice, and today she was finally paying the bill for that choice. I looked at the grandfather clock, ticking heavily in the hallway. I told her she had exactly 1 hour. I gave her 60 minutes to walk upstairs, pack a single suitcase with whatever clothes she could carry, and walk out the front door. I informed her that the deed to the estate remained entirely protected by the trust, and she no longer had any legal right to occupy the premises. I warned her that if I found her inside this house when the grandfather clock chimed the next hour, I would call the local police and have her physically arrested for criminal trespassing. I turned my back on her, leaving her sobbing uncontrollably over the photocopied evidence of her own greed. I walked toward the kitchen to brew a fresh pot of coffee, completely indifferent to the sounds of her frantic, panicked footsteps running up the stairs. I listened as she tore through her massive closets, desperately trying to stuff thousands of dollars worth of useless silk and designer labels into a single piece of luggage. She was a captain, sinking with her own ship, completely weighed down by the heavy gold she refused to leave behind. The parasite was finally being excised, and the house was about to be completely clean. 7 days had passed since the federal raid completely shattered the toxic illusion my niece and her husband had built. I drove my restored vintage pickup truck down the winding asphalt road leading toward the Oak Creek Veterans Retreat. The morning air was crisp and clean, completely devoid of the heavy, suffocating tension that had defined the previous week. I rolled the window down, letting the cool autumn breeze rush through the cabin. The rhythmic hum of the powerful engine was a comforting reminder that order had finally returned to the world. My tactical mission was officially over. I pulled the heavy truck into the circular driveway of the medical facility and parked near the front courtyard where this entire operation had begun. I turned off the engine, stepped out of the cabin, and leaned against the polished steel fender, waiting patiently for my twin brother to emerge from his sanctuary. The heavy glass doors of the main reception area slid open with a soft mechanical hum. Henry walked out into the bright morning sunlight, taking a deep breath of the fresh air. The physical and psychological transformation was absolutely remarkable. He was no longer the broken, terrified old man who had slumped onto the wooden bench a week ago, expecting to lose his entire life. He stood completely straight, his shoulders pulled back with a renewed sense of quiet dignity and strength. The dark, ugly swelling around his left eye had faded into a faint, yellowish shadow, easily hidden behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a crisp, button-down shirt and comfortable tailored slacks, looking exactly like the proud, successful professional he had always been. The enforced medical isolation and the absolute removal of extreme stress had completely healed his fractured ribs and restored his shattered nervous system. He saw me leaning against the truck, and a genuine warm smile spread across his face, reaching all the way to his eyes. He walked down the concrete path with a steady, confident stride and reached out, grabbing my hand in a firm, solid grip. We did not need to exchange any dramatic words or emotional speeches. The nightmare was completely over, and he knew he was finally safe. We drove back to the sprawling brick estate in comfortable, companionable silence, simply listening to the low, steady rumble of the vintage engine and watching the suburban landscape roll by. I pulled into the sweeping circular driveway, and we walked up the stone steps to the heavy mahogany front door. I reached into my pocket and handed Henry his brass house keys. He looked at the metal keys for a long moment, before sliding one into the lock. He turned the mechanism himself and pushed the heavy door open, stepping over the threshold into his own foyer. The atmosphere inside the entire house was completely different. The oppressive, terrifying weight of Bradley, violent anger, and Allison cold vanity had been entirely eradicated. The shattered crystal had been swept away, and the expensive imported shoes and designer handbags that usually cluttered the hallway were completely gone. Allison had managed to pack exactly one suitcase before fleeing into the unknown, leaving behind the heavy, suffocating illusion of her unearned wealth. The house was absolutely quiet, but it was no longer the tense, terrifying silence of a hostage situation waiting for the next violent explosion. It was the beautiful, absolute tranquility of a reclaimed home. Henry walked slowly through the first floor, running his hand gently along the polished dining room table where the monster had finally been defeated. He walked into the formal living room and sat down right in the middle of his favorite leather armchair. It was the exact same chair Bradley used to occupy when he was drunkenly shouting his aggressive threats. Now it belonged entirely to my brother again. I walked into the kitchen and opened the heavy mahogany cabinet, finding the crystal decanter Henry kept hidden in the back. I poured 2 generous measures of premium aged bourbon into heavy glass tumblers, listening to the satisfying splash of the amber liquid. I walked back into the living room and handed him a glass. We raised our drinks, clinking the heavy glass together in a silent toast to survival and the permanent restoration of family boundaries. We took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the warm liquid burn smoothly down our throats. We did not speak a single word about Bradley. We knew he was currently sitting in a cold, concrete federal holding cell, entirely stripped of his tailored suits and his arrogance, awaiting a trial that would undoubtedly send him to a maximum security prison for decades. We did not speak about Allison, who was currently drowning under the crushing weight of her own unsecured debt, entirely cut off from the bank accounts she had worshipped. They were ghosts permanently exorcised from our lives, fading rapidly into the irrelevance they deserved. We simply sat in the warm sunlight streaming through the large living room windows and talked calmly about the future. Henry mentioned wanting to travel to the coast to do some deep-sea fishing, and I offered to help him rebuild the wooden deck in the backyard before the winter snow arrived. He laughed, a genuine, hearty sound that filled the empty corners of the massive house. The parasites were permanently gone. The fortress was completely secure. The silent adjustment was officially and permanently complete. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that biological ties do not automatically entitle anyone to your endless sacrifice, nor do they excuse systemic abuse. For decades, my brother believed that because Allison was his daughter, he had to endure her cruelty and finance her husband's crimes to maintain the illusion of a family. But true family is defined by mutual respect, genuine protection, and unconditional care. Blood may connect you to toxic people, but you always retain the absolute right to sever those ties to protect your own peace and dignity. Justice and self-respect must always outweigh the destructive demands of entitled relatives. If you have ever had to draw a hard line and cut ties with toxic family members to protect your own peace, share your story in the comments below, and do not forget to like and subscribe for more tales of ultimate justice.